In the spring of 1942, an American fighter arrived on British airfields that nobody was particularly excited about. It was fast enough at low altitude, reasonably maneuverable and decently armed. But take it above 15,000 feet and the engine began to gasp. The supercharger couldn't keep up. Performance fell away badly. The Royal Air Force used it for low-level reconnaissance work, kept it away from German interceptors at altitude, and regarded it as a capable but limited machine. Its name was the North American P-51 Mustang. Nobody yet knew it would save the entire Allied daylight bombing campaign, or that the answer was sitting in a different engine bay. The story of how an ordinary fighter became the most important American aircraft of the European War begins not with an American engineer or an Army Air Forces program, but with a British test pilot who flew the Mustang on a spring afternoon in 1942 and came away with an idea. Ronald Harker was a Rolls-Royce test pilot based at Hucknall Aerodrome, 7 miles north of Nottingham, in the English Midlands. In April 1942, he evaluated a Mustang powered by its standard American Allison V1710 engine. He liked the airframe immediately. The Mustang's laminar flow wing was clean and aerodynamically efficient in ways that contemporary British designs were not. Drag had been shaved from every surface with unusual care. The fuselage was elegant, the cooling system cleverly integrated. The whole aircraft was faster at low altitude than anything it had any right to be given its size. But the Allison was throttling everything the airframe could have been. It had no two-stage supercharger. It could not maintain its performance as the air thinned above 15,000 feet. Harker did the math. His company made the Merlin 61, a two-stage, two-speed supercharged V-12 that had already transformed the Spitfire's high-altitude capability and powered the Lancaster on its long night missions over Germany. The Merlin was only 1 inch longer than the Allison. What, Harker asked, would happen if you put that engine in this airframe? There was no immediate support at the Air Ministry. The RAF was already running its Merlin production to the absolute limit. Spitfires, Hurricanes, Lancasters, and Mosquitoes all drew from the same supply. Taking Merlins for an experiment with an American aircraft seemed extravagant, but Harker pressed the case, found a senior champion in Air Chief Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, and in the summer of 1942, the RAF authorized re-engining 5 Mustang airframes. The modified aircraft were designated the Mustang X. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew on October 13, 1942, with Rolls-Royce Chief Test Pilot Captain R.T. Shepard at the controls. The results were not subtle. The Allison engine Mustang had struggled above 15,000 feet. The Merlin engine version reached speeds in excess of 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison variant at high altitude. The same airframe with a different engine was now a different class of aircraft entirely. Trials completed by year's end confirmed what Harker's instinct had said. This was an exceptional high-altitude, high-speed fighter. The RAF could not produce it in quantity. Their Merlins were spoken for, but the Americans could. The Detroit firm Packard Motor Car Company was already building the Merlin under license. The engine that would change the European air war could be manufactured in American factories at American industrial scale. The American Army Air Forces moved quickly. North American Aviation redesigned the engine installation and the 4-bladed propeller to accommodate the Packard-built Merlin, designated the V1650. The new variant went into production as the P-51B and P-51C by the fall of 1942. Test Mustangs were flying at 441 miles per hour at nearly 30,000 feet. Mass production followed. In December 1943, the first P-51BS entered combat in Europe with the 354th Fighter Group, the unit that would be known as the Pioneer Mustang Group. That timing mattered enormously, because by the end of 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign over Europe was in crisis. A crisis so severe it called into question whether strategic daylight bombing was survivable at all. The strategic logic had been straightforward. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress would fly in tight defensive formations, their combined machine gun fire protecting them from German interceptors, and strike precise industrial targets in Germany from high altitude. Planners believed that enough guns, flying in the right formations, could hold off any fighter attack. That theory ran into the reality of the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilots were experienced, tactically innovative, and flying from home fields. They quickly found the angles. Head-on attacks closed at enormous speed, overloaded the gunners, killed pilots and bombardiers before defensive fire could respond effectively. The Germans developed cannon-armed fighters specifically for bomber-killing heavy armament at the cost of some agility, but the bombers were not maneuvering in formation anyway. Rockets could be lobbed into the streams from outside effective machine gun range. The formations bled. And there was a structural problem the Americans had not fully solved: the range of available escort fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the Spitfire could protect the bombers over the English Channel and into the margins of occupied Europe. Even with drop tanks, the P-47's range barely reached the German border. Beyond that line, the escorts had to turn back. German fighter controllers knew the pattern precisely. They tracked the formations on radar, calculated when the escorts would leave, and held their interceptors in reserve. When the little friends peeled away and headed for home, the full strength of the defending Gruppe rose to meet the now-naked bomber streams. Distance had been the Luftwaffe's most powerful defensive weapon, and nothing in the American inventory had been able to take it away. The results were devastating. On August 17, 1943, 60 American bombers were lost on raids targeting Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the fighter gauntlet beginning precisely where the escorts ran out of fuel. The formations pressed on alone through a storm of cannon fire and rockets. 60 aircraft meant 600 men. It was a catastrophic morning, and it was not the last one. On October 14, 1943, a date the 8th Air Force would call Black Thursday, 291 B-17s were dispatched on a second strike against Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants. 60 did not come back. 17 more were so badly damaged they were written off. More than 600 airmen were lost over enemy territory in a single afternoon. The loss rate exceeded 20%. The 10-man crew of each B-17 was required to complete 25 missions to rotate home. In 1943, only about 1 in 4 8th Air Force bomber crewmen managed to finish that tour. The other 3 were killed, badly wounded, or captured. After Black Thursday, the Army Air Forces suspended deep raids into Germany. The unescorted daylight campaign had been stopped cold. The Mustang broke that deadlock. By March 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched its first heavy bomber strikes against Berlin itself, roughly 175 P-51B and C Mustangs were operating in the theater. The bomber crews called their escorts the Little Friends, a term that carried enormous weight after the months when there had been no friends at all beyond the bomb line. For the first time, fighters could go all the way to Berlin, deep in the heart of the Reich, over 1,000 miles round trip from English bases, and fight their way back out again. The drop tanks that the Merlin engine Mustangs could carry extended their practical range in a way that nothing else in the Allied inventory matched at high altitude. Nothing the Luftwaffe had expected to face could do that. German fighter controllers had built their entire defensive doctrine around the moment the escort turned back. The Mustang eliminated that moment. The calculations that had kept German interceptors waiting in safety were no longer valid. There was no safe distance anymore. In early February 1944, Major General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force and issued an order that changed how the Mustangs fought. Until then, escort fighters had been required to stay close to the bombers at all times, drive the attackers away, then returned to formation. Doolittle threw that doctrine out. His fighters were now ordered to pursue and destroy the enemy. Go down and kill them on the ground if necessary. The job was no longer protection only. It was the annihilation of the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. The P-51, with its speed, its altitude performance, and its 650 caliber machine guns, was exactly the instrument for that mission. The results followed fast. Operation Argument Big Week ran from February 20 through 25, 1944. American and British air forces hammered German aircraft production facilities and, more importantly, forced the Luftwaffe into the air to defend them. The German command had no choice. If they did not rise to meet the raids, the factories would burn and production would fall. If they did rise to meet the raids, the Mustangs were waiting at altitude. Either way, Germany lost something it could not replace at the rate it was losing it. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots, men who had been flying since Spain or Poland or the Battle of Britain, veterans with hundreds of aerial engagements behind them, were being killed at numbers that could not be replaced on the same timescale. German pilot training had not been built to absorb casualties at this rate. Fuel shortages were already cutting into training hours. The instructors were being pulled from academies and sent to frontline units. The replacements who came after them arrived with fewer flying hours than the men they replaced. One of the core advantages the Luftwaffe had always carried, the deep experience of its senior pilots, was being ground down by attrition, mission by mission, over the spring of 1944. The skill gap that had made the Luftwaffe so dangerous in 1940 and 1941 was closing fast, and it was closing in the wrong direction for Germany. By the end of the war, American P-51 pilots were credited with destroying approximately 4,950 enemy aircraft in the air, more than any other American fighter type in the European theater. The 4th Fighter Group, the 357th, the 354th, and others carved through the Luftwaffe over France, Germany, Austria, and the Reich capital itself. The 357th Fighter Group alone was credited with 609 aerial kills. At peak production, in January 1945, American factories were rolling Mustangs off the lines at Dallas and Inglewood at a combined rate of 881 aircraft per month. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall who commanded the Luftwaffe, was later reported to have said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." Whether those were his exact words in that precise form, the sentiment was historically accurate. Göring had famously told the German nation in the early war years that enemy bombers would never reach Berlin, that if they did, Germany could call him by another name. When the Mustangs arrived over the capital with the bombers in the spring of 1944, the bluster was over. The Luftwaffe could no longer keep the war's destruction away from Germany's cities, its oil refineries, its rail lines, its factories. The Mustangs were hunting. The aircraft that accomplished all of this had begun as something nobody had planned in quite that way. North American Aviation had originally designed the P-51 airframe for the British Purchasing Commission in 1940, drawing on earlier design work, but incorporating the laminar flow wing that gave it its exceptional aerodynamic efficiency. The British named it the Mustang. It went to war with the wrong engine for its intended role. A British test pilot saw what it could become. His company re-engined 5 aircraft. American factories scaled what could not be scaled in Britain. The Packard Merlin gave the American airframe what the Allison never could: high-altitude power, supercharged performance at 30,000 feet, and the range to reach any target in Germany and come back. It is the kind of story that only happens in wartime, when necessity strips away bureaucratic hesitation and the right people encounter each other at the right moment. Harker's idea was not officially sanctioned at first. The RAF could not afford to act on it in production quantities. The Americans could. The result of that international back and forth, British airframe expertise, British engine innovation, American manufacturing scale, was the aircraft that removed the last safe sky the Luftwaffe had depended on. For the bomber crews who had flown into Germany with nothing between them and the waiting interceptors, the arrival of the little friends was the difference between a tour they could survive and one they almost certainly could not. In 1943, the odds were crushing. By the summer of 1944, the threat was collapsing. The P-51 did not win the air war alone. The P-47 flew tens of thousands of sorties. The B-17 and B-24 crews pressed on through their worst months with extraordinary courage, and the ground crews who maintained the aircraft in freezing English fields were as much a part of the campaign as any pilot. But the Mustang is where the decisive change concentrated. The aircraft that no one was particularly excited about in 1942, the one that struggled above 15,000 feet, the one parked on the margin of the RAF's plans, became, with a different engine and at a different altitude, the fighter that Goering feared to see over his capital. The machine that broke the Luftwaffe had arrived in Britain as an ordinary fighter with the wrong power plant. It took a test pilot's afternoon flight, 5 experimental aircraft, and the manufacturing capacity of a nation that had never been bombed to find out what it really was.